Considered to be the first global empire in the world, the Portuguese Empire was the first European power that started the era of exploration. Being one of the longest-lived empires in European history, it lasted almost 6 centuries, starting from the conquest of Ceuta in northern Africa in 1415 and stretching across the globe, with bases in North and South America, Africa, and various regions of Asia and Oceania. But it officially came to an end in 1999, when, much like the UK with Hong Kong, Portugal had to transfer the sovereignty over Macau back to China. And since then, things changed quite drastically. China is now on its way to become the biggest economy in the world, and Portugal, well, it went from one of the major players in the globe to a country at the corner of Europe peacefully enjoying the sun and its beaches. Nevertheless, the glory of the past still gives the Iberian nation an influence over the international affairs. Even though its colonies didn't turn out as well as the British, they still have great relationships with the Portuguese government and their people. Being the westernmost country in Europe, their policies and minds couldn't be better described as having Western values. And despite some battles between their fellow Western European nations in the past, ever since World War I and subsequently World War II, Portugal has sided with the Allies. Even though their official status was neutral, as they did not fight in the Second World War, they greatly benefited the Allies, mostly because of the great relationship with the UK. These two countries have the longest lasting military alliance in history, lasting 600 years and counting. This close relationship also brought great benefits for the US, as they were allowed to use the invaluable Azores military bases in the middle of the Atlantic, together with the British, and were able to supply, refuel, and connect the United States with the forces on English soil. This has brought total control of the Northern Atlantic to Western forces, and the US does not want to lose this. Ever since that time, they have kept a permanent military presence on the Base das Lajes, and are determined to keep it that way. With the recent economic war between China and the US, Portugal has used this base as a bargaining chip. With China gaining influence over most of Africa, the US can't afford to lose their control over the North Atlantic. The Chinese global expansion and flux of money has also reached Portugal. The purchase of the energy giant EDP has seen Portugal's biggest company now being owned indirectly by the Chinese government. Chinese companies have also invested heavily in Portugal's struggling financial sector. Fosun International bought a 27% stake in Millennium Bank, Portugal's largest bank, for 1.2 billion euros. In 2014, Fosun bought Fidelidade, the country's largest insurance company, for 1 billion euros, and in the same year, it invested a further 460 million euros when it bought Luz Saúde, Portugal's largest healthcare provider. These kinds of investments makes countries like this think twice when speaking about the Chinese regime. But that was just the beginning. With the infamous gold visas that gave Chinese men Portuguese visas as long as they invested in the country, Portuguese citizens have seen the values of their house markets skyrocket, and the rents in major cities simply become unbearable. And there is no sign of slowing down, because since then, the two governments have already signed 17 cooperation pacts in various sectors. Now Portugal sees itself walking on a tightrope. But how long can it continue to play both sides of the US-China rivalry? Jutting into the Atlantic Ocean 65 miles south of Lisbon, Portugal's Sines Peninsula has long been recognized by foreign powers for its geostrategic importance. The Romans, the Visigoths, the Moors all established settlements along the natural deepwater port. Today, however, plans to redevelop the port have become the latest source of friction between the US and China, suggesting that Portugal's diplomacy strategy of courting both rivals is running out of runway. Sines is the closest port in mainland Europe to America's eastern shale basins. US firms want to expand the port's liquid natural gas terminal in order to increase gas exports to the continent, which would also help reduce the European Union's energy dependence on Russia. In 2018, George Glass, the US ambassador to Portugal, said that he proposed American investments in Sines would convert Portugal into the Singapore of Western Europe, and that made Portugal politicians' eyes light up. But Beijing has its own plans for scenes. He proposed 640 million Chinese-built container port that is a key project in China's Belt and Road Initiative, the global infrastructure program of which Portugal became a member in December of 2018. As a result, the optimism Glass expressed 2 years ago has more recently been replaced by a sharper-edged tone. Speaking to Portuguese media in August, Glass warned that a Chinese container port at Sines would affect the US vision for the port's development. Lisbon, he said, had to choose between its historical ally, the US, and its Chinese economic partners. He added that this is not the same China that Portugal has dealt with for the last 500 years. This is a new China, with long-term plans for malign influence through economics, politics, and other means. The rather stark warning reflected not only US concerns over Chinese ownership of key physical infrastructures in Europe, but also the wider ramifications of what Chinese leader Xi Jinping calls China and Portugal's global strategic partnership. Few other European nations receive such elevated status in Beijing's diplomacy pantheon. The professor of geopolitics at the Portuguese Catholic University, Miguel Monjardinho, said in an interview, "The objective of the global strategic partnership was not just to deepen the relationships between Portugal and China, but also to serve the strategic interests of both countries in Europe and in the world. Portugal gains the support of a power destined to play a crucial role in the 21st century. Beijing, on the other hand, acquires technologies and greater influence in Portugal's economic and diplomatic efforts around the globe." It was from Sines that Vasco da Gama set out on a bold naval explorations that will convert Portugal into a global empire. The legacy of that far-flung empire has afforded Portugal a geostrategic reach beyond its modest size and amplified its diplomatic leverage with major powers. The former colony of Macau has been a bridge for bilateral relations with China. Meanwhile, Portugal's Azores Islands, located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, have hosted US military bases since World War I and were a crucial factor facilitating Portugal's early accession to NATO. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, however, it was the Chinese who provided help in Portugal's time of need. Over the past decade, Chinese firms have paid generous sums for stakes in Portugal's state-run power generation and electrical distribution firms, as well as in private finance and healthcare companies. Portugal became one of the largest recipients of Chinese investment per capita in Europe. In the same period, the EU offered meager support in comparison, and the US scaled back its military footprint, and with it, investment in southern Europe, including at its largest air base in Azores. The legacy of the financial crisis in Portugal was devastating for the perception of the EU in the country, and there was a sense of abandonment from both of Portugal's political alliances due to the Obama administration policies. The Portuguese government at the time welcomed Chinese investments because they felt it gave them more foreign policy options. In recent years, Portugal has entertained China's proposal to establish a research station in the Azores and decided not to place limitations on Huawei's participation on its 5G network. In August, the state-owned China Communications Construction Company announced that it was in the final stages of purchasing a 30% stake in Mota-Engil, Portugal's flagship engineering and construction firm with a large portfolio of infrastructure projects in Africa and Latin America. In recent years, Chinese companies have invested about 10 billion euros in the country. A professor at the US Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, John Denny, said in an interview later in the year, "After the global financial crisis, China used its lender of last resort status to increase its soft power in Europe. Beijing's strategic goal is to maintain Europe as a contested ground and to undermine solidarity on foreign policy issues. Chinese firms are also looking to acquire firms that give them a footprint elsewhere in the world and to acquire technology or enter new markets. With European nations, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, experienced sharp economic downturns due to the coronavirus pandemic and requiring liquidity, the conditions look ripe for China to reprise the role it played after 2009. But it will be much harder this time, according to Danny. Europe's stance towards China has hardened in recent years, he says, following instances of intellectual property theft by Chinese corporations, human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and the Chinese handling and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. More stringent investment screening processes have been introduced, and in Brussels, Portugal's alleged economic dependence on China has attracted criticism. Cozying up to China was once a surefire way to attract more attention from the US and the EU, but increasingly that attention comes with diplomatic costs rather than benefits. Glass's heavy-handed comments in August were not well received by the Portuguese press or political class. President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa said it was an obvious matter of principle that in Portugal, those who decide its destiny are the representatives chosen by the people, and only them. Nevertheless, there is a dawning recognition that the strategy of the past decade, by which Lisbon played its relationships with the US, China and Brussels against each other for the maximum gain, will not be an option much longer. Portugal is the barometer of international politics. Small countries are always the first ones to feel the impact of the world's tectonic shifts. Sooner or later, circumstances and necessity will force us to make choices. Between all of these, there are also major Portuguese interests. The Portuguese government is currently waiting on a decision by the International Committee that, if accepted, will see the country more than double its size, becoming the 10th largest exclusive economic zone in the world. But more on that in a later video. To know more about the Port of Sines and its projects, please watch the video on the screen where I describe all the major plans that Google, Facebook and Microsoft have on this megaport. Thank you very much for subscribing. We are now at the 1000 subscriber mark. Don't forget to leave a like and I'll see you in the next one. Obrigado.